Hey everybody, Hoosier Jedi here with another review for you. This time I'm talking episode 5 of season 5 of The Walking Dead called Self-Help. And this is our big focus in on Abraham's group, and we learn quite a bit about him and Eugene, and get a little bit more insight into Rosita. Now, I did sort of need to be refreshed a little bit on exactly what was going on with Abraham because it's been a long time since I've read the stuff that focused on him in the comics. Eugene I remembered pretty well simply because his whole thing of "I'm not a scientist," it's a pretty memorable moment. But anyway, let's start in with Abraham. And here again, I kind of had forgotten a lot of the details of his backstory, but this here we do really come to understand just why Abraham is so utterly focused on getting to Washington D.C. And it's because simply Eugene and his mission are literally the only reason has not killed himself. I mean, we first meet Abraham. He is literally like about 3 seconds from killing himself. I mean, he has already put a gun in his mouth when he happens to hear Eugene screaming and begging for help. So the idea of that, anything that sort of puts this reason he's given himself to live in any sort of delay or jeopardy is just unacceptable to him. Even though, as a military guy, and remember, we do see his dog tags a couple of times in this episode if you're paying attention. Abraham should understand the idea of moving with having a reasonably good sized group. Rick and his crew. Taking the time to properly scavenge for supplies, to rest. I mean, as a military dude, he should understand all of this, just as he should understand how his plan for getting through the tsunami to steal a line from Z Nation, which if you're not watching is actually one very funny, and two actually has a pretty decent story to it. I actually do live tweets for Z Nation on Fridays, and I'm really enjoying that show. But anyway, it all just basically boils down to Abraham is a guy suffering from serious tunnel vision. If you take away that one thing that he's given himself to live for, like what happens this episode, he just completely and utterly shuts down. Now, what's interesting is I look at what happened to him in the flashbacks, and we see him apparently beating to death some guys with his bare hands who are trying to attack his family. And this causes his wife to run off with their kids. And, this seems strange. I mean, those people were almost certainly trying to harm Abraham's family. So, him doing what he needed to do to protect them is perfectly understandable. Now, granted, it can't be easy to watch your husband or dad beat people to death with his bare hands. But, survival is not often pretty. It just sort of makes me wonder if maybe Abraham might be carrying a little bit of PTSD around from his time in the military, and that maybe this is not the first time he's sort of flipped out. Now, I'm not accusing him of saying, having hurt his wife and children in any way, shape, or form. Abraham, at the end of the day, is a good guy. He's not the sort of person who I think would do that. But I can't imagine that he may have, sort of gone off on a screaming match or had a screaming fit or something, or basically just done something else in the past that might have caused his wife to be a little bit afraid of him. Not intentionally, of course, but PTSD is a nasty customer. And of course, Abraham kind of comes across their bodies later on, and they've obviously been killed by walkers and possibly even been laying there for a while. And that's kind of one of the things that always puzzled me is seeing people who get eaten by the zombies, even if it's just partially, don't seem to rise up. Or at least if they do, I haven't particularly zoned in on, hey, that walker was somebody who was being eaten and then just sort of sat up. It really fits into that classic question of zombie movies is, why is it that the zombies never finish their meal? I mean, the only time I've ever seen that really addressed was in the game Dead Island, and it's just that the zombies have eaten somebody's body to the point where it's just like, there's no way that could rise to being a zombie. Then again, I guess if there was still any sort of brain, it could, but whatever. Let's see. We also kind of get to see a little bit more of Abraham's relationship with Rosita, and I do genuinely like those two together. They do have a nice dynamic, and obviously Abraham cares about her, but it's very much sort of a relationship, I think, of convenience more than genuine romantic interest. It's just two people who've kind of come to an agreement under the circumstances that, hey, when we get a free moment and things are cool, let's go off and have some fun. And of course, Abraham even expresses that far more crudely to Glenn, who just kind of has a, yeah, I didn't need to know that, which was definitely a nice little bit of lightheartedness in the depths of what's otherwise a pretty rough episode. One thing I have to also say, kind of moving on from Abraham, is that I like what they're doing with Rosita on the show. Here, she's a much more action-oriented character than I remember her being from the comics. In the comics, you kind of just got the impression that Rosita was a pretty girl who sort of hooked up with Abraham so that she'd have somebody to protect her in the zombie apocalypse, because Abraham is a tough son of a bitch. And hey, fair enough, you do what you got to do in the zombie apocalypse. Here, it's taken her and made her a much more proactive person, somebody who can sort of stand on her own to a pretty reasonable degree, and I do like that. The show, I think, now that Andrea never really lived up to her potential in the comics that she had from the comics. And remember, as I've said in these reviews before, in the comics, Andrea is my favorite character. On the show, my favorite character, it's kind of hard for me to pin down. It sort of alternates among Glenn, Maggie, and Beth. Yeah, I like Beth. Okay, sue me. But anyway, getting back to Rosita. Yeah, well, she does kind of have an interesting relationship with Eugene. She like Abraham is just mostly amused by the idea that he peeps on them when they're having sex. She doesn't really care, but she does obviously care about Eugene. I mean, they've been together for a long time, and they've come to form a bond. And we'll see some more of that as time goes on. Just kind of wrapping up Abraham's group, Eugene. One thing that disappointed me about his confession was that he didn't really get the chance to elaborate on it too much. And it's something I suppose we might see next episode or whenever it is that we see Eugene again, and he's able to talk properly. But shortly after he made that confession in the comics, they asked him, "Well, hey, you're not a scientist. Before everything went to hell, what were you?" And he just sort of looks at the ground and mutters, "High school biology teacher." But both Eugene and Tara are correct when they say that just because he's not the scientist who can save the world doesn't mean that Eugene can't contribute. If you read the comics after the reveal, Eugene, does go out and prove himself. Excuse me. He does, show that his intelligence is an asset and that he can come up with things that can really help the survivors out. And in fact, one thing he does figure out eventually basically really saves everybody's ass when it comes for dealing with Negan, who is one of the major bad guys in the comics who we're probably going to get to see next season. And yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Negan is a son of a bitch, but he's also pretty darn hilarious as well. It was interesting to see Eugene spend a little bit more time talking with Tara and kind of them further their bond a little bit. Eugene has this really weird habit of sort of obviously taking an interest in women that he knows he can't have. But let's face it, I think we've all been guilty of taking an interest in somebody we know we can't have at some point in our lives. And also, to be completely fair to Eugene, the guy obviously has some interpersonal communication deficiency issues, as Eugene might put it. The only thing I can really complain about in terms of Tara this episode is that when Eugene admits to sabotaging the bus, she's very quick to just not really press him for details as to why he would do that. It's like, okay, so why don't you want to get to Washington, D.C.? I mean, this is totally, you're going to totally reverse these things and save the world. Why are you not in the biggest hurry ever to do that? Because it means, no longer having to worry about being devoured by zombies. And again, she just very briefly raises objections in that direction, and then just lets it go and just like makes him promise like don't do it again. And that's stupid. There's really no other way to put that. Let's see. Nothing particular to say about what's going on with Glenn and Maggie, and I think I might have mentioned this in my reviews before. I think we're just going to have to let the fact that Maggie has really not said very much about Beth at this point. I think we're just going to have to let that go. All right. I think the writers probably understand they sort of dropped the ball on that one, but it's too late and there's just too much else to do for them to really go back and address that. So we're just going to have to put that down as a notable flaw in this particular run of the show. Now some other stuff. I definitely like the group setting up their camp in that bookstore. I admit that if something like a zombie apocalypse did happened, I probably don't think I would be able to resist going and poking around the library or a bookstore trying to find books on useful things to help me survive, like I don't know, how to butcher animals or whatever. Like my stepdad is a hunter. He knows how to do stuff like that. I don't. I'd have to either have somebody teach me or go and read a book about it. And or actually, I've seen like at the local Barnes and Noble these books on survival skills. And I've always kind of thought it would be interesting to pick one of those up just to sort of read about how all that works, but I've never bothered. But then if something like apocalypse comes down, yeah, like getting to this someplace where I could get like a manual on survival, yeah, that would be something I'd totally do. Of course, Eugene opts to make off with a copy of H.G. Wells' The Shape of Things to Come, which is one of Wells' fairly well-known novels. I believe it was 1933 that came out. And it's just sort of, I guess technically it falls under alternate history, but it's Wells' sort of idea of how you could kind of go from where things were in the 1930s to a utopian society. Unsurprisingly, things are not all sunshine and kittens, but Wells believed that it was genuinely possible to get there. And I think that Eugene reading that just sort of is sort of an irony. It's very obvious that no way in hell is a utopia anywhere near on the horizon. So I think it's just sort of Eugene trying to go back and just wrap himself up in fantasy to a little bit, to look at it back at a time when there was more optimism about the future. Not that things weren't pretty darn rough in the 1930s, but even during rough times, having optimism can help people get through a lot. Well, things don't get much rougher than a zombie apocalypse, and optimism under those circumstances is obviously pretty hard to come by. Just all that stuff with the zombies and the fire truck, that was awesome. That was great. I love that. If it wasn't for the fact that they killed a zombie with an egg beater over on Z Nation, that whole thing with the fire hose might possibly be my favorite zombie kill of all time. Just that was just awesome. And yeah, I kind of think that covers everything that I had to say about this episode. A lot of good stuff going around, and next episode is going to be our Carol and Daryl episode, where we get to see what they've been up to, and doubtlessly setting things up for the resolution of what's going to be going on with Beth. And until then, guys, as always, please comment, rate, and subscribe, and of course you can follow me on Twitter at Hoosier Jedi. Until next time, take care and have a good one.